Voting in parliaments in Australia. Australia is a democracy, meaning that its citizens get to vote on who becomes the country's government. And I want to go over this process because I think that it's a good system. But before we continue, just keep in mind that I'm just some random guy on the internet. And if you are able to vote and have questions about the process, please refer to the Australian Electoral Commission, who is responsible for running federal elections, or their state or territory counterpart as appropriate. Depending on where you live in Australia, you have 2 or 3 levels of government. There is the federal government, which is responsible for defence of the country and issues like immigration. Then we have states or territories that are responsible for issues like education and health. And there's a third level, there's local government, which is responsible for parks and roads and other local issues. Some areas like the Australian Capital Territory only have 2 levels, as the territory government is also the local government. The Constitution of Australia defines which level of government is responsible for what items, and state parliaments have created laws to create local governments. In this presentation, I'll focus on the federal government and the process for voting for them. In Australia, voting is compulsory. When you're 18, you're meant to register to vote, even though you can avoid it if you want. But once you are registered to vote, it's your responsibility to ensure that you vote. Now, the government and the AEC go out of their way to make sure you're given every opportunity to vote. It's not like the government says your voting's only going to be on Tuesday, the 15th of the month, and between 3:30 and 3:35. When the election day, there's a lot of voting centres available, usually at local schools, halls, and community centres. Then there's also pre-polling, which is available at a few areas, but for the first, say, 2 weeks prior, you can vote through pre-polling. There's also postal voting, where people can nominate and get a ballot sent out to them, which they then post back in. They don't have to they can do it before election day for postal voting, or they can do it on election day, and which means that some of the votes can still be posted in if the seat's very close after the election. But there's a lot of opportunities to vote. Even if you're well outside of your local area, there's voting centres in each of the capitals and similar that can take vote for people that aren't in their local area. So even if you don't vote, if you've forgotten or something along those lines, or something happens, it's only effectively a slap on the wrist if you don't. It's something like an $80 fine. I'm not too sure what it is, but the onus is on. Yeah, it's effectively the government has made every chance for people to vote. So at the federal level, we have 3 barriers or gates that legislation has to get through to become law. It has to pass the House of Representatives, it has to pass the Senate, and it also has to be approved by the Governor-General. The House of Representatives is also known as the People's House, and at the moment it consists of 151 people who are elected from their local area of about, I'm not sure of the numbers, but let's just say it's 50 to 120,000. So the Australian Electoral Commission draws up charts of Australia into local areas with roughly the same size of people. So there might be an area of South Australia that's like the northern half of South Australia. I believe the Northern Territory only has 2 seats, where one is effectively inside Darwin and the rest of the Northern Territory is it. Whereas in Sydney, because of some high density housing and similar, you might only have a few suburbs that consist of an electorate. And each of these are meant to be the same. So if you live in the electorate, then you get to vote for whoever throws their hat in the ring and wants to become the local member. You can't vote for someone outside of your region, even if no matter how much you like them. There's a chance to do that for the Senate, but we'll come back to that later. So once all of the votes are counted, then these 150 people, each representing a roughly equal proportion of the Australian citizens, will go to Canberra, which is where the federal parliament is located, and then pass legislation based on that. Now, then there's also the Senate, which is consists of 76 senators. And it's made up of each state gets 12 senators, and each territory, well, the Australian Capital Territory and the Northern Territory, each get 2. So the rules were a little bit different for the territories and the states, and they get more. But this come about because they, whoever wrote the Constitution, and particularly at the time, a lot of the people who were in living in Australia at the time were in Melbourne and Sydney, and they didn't want people from that area to be able to, if they just had one house, to make laws and advantageous and make themselves advantageous, to say pass taxes on other people or to put levies extra on farming because of the only few people living out in the bush. And I'll just come back to the House of Representatives and the Senate. So I believe Tasmania only has about 5 seats in the House of Representatives, but they make up for it because they then get 12 seats in the Senate. So while the House of Representatives is meant to be a local member, the Senate is considered the House of Review, and it's composed of people elected by a state area. So each electorate, I said, between 50 and 150, and you can only vote for that. But the second group is based on state and territory. And anyone who wants to become a senator can get their name on the ballot, and the same ballot is used by everybody in that state or territory. So I'll just go back to the differentiation. If you're in the ACT or the Northern Territory, when you elect a senator, they are elected for a term of 3 years. And every single time there's an election, there's a Senate election, there's they get to go through. But for the 6 senators in, it's known as a half Senate election, every 3 years there's a Senate election that the senators for the state are elected for a 6-year term. And half of them are elected at one point, and then the other half are elected. So you know that if you're elected for the Senate, you could sort of skip the next one, and you could be in for a while. There's a slim chance, I'll come back to something else later, that you might finish earlier, but effectively your term is locked in. The House of Representatives, the elections can be held. The Constitution says that, there's a limit on how long the House can sit for. It might just so the Constitution states it explicitly, but just take it as read that every 3 years there's going to be a House of Representatives election, and the same for the Senate. It is possible that an election for a House of Representatives can be held by itself, but convention has been that if you're going to vote, you vote for both the House and Representatives. The Prime Minister of the day has the ability to go to the Governor General and request that the House be dissolved, and they don't actually need a reason or any constitutional trigger to do this. They can just say, yep, I want an election. There was one case, I might have been in the 70s, where a party got in, they formed government, they might have had a slim majority, and the leader knew if we go and have an election again, we would be able to get better numbers. And if you've only got 151 people you need legislation to pass, and that means if you've got only about 60 people and you need 15 from some to get other votes as well, if you can then go for a re-election and then get 80 people or 85 people of your own side, that's going to make the process of governing much easier, because you don't need to convince other people in the moment. So now, right now, I believe 2023, the federal government has a Labor majority, or possibly a slim crossbench is required. But there was a whole lot of going on. What if who needs this? And if you go back in time and have a look at, there was a close election, I believe it was 2013, where it was Julia Gillard versus Tony Abbott. And because there are a few people in the middle, they had the power to decide who was going to be in government. And both of the Julia and Tony went to these independents and they said, you know, this is why we need my vote. This is what a government will go for. Eventually they sided with Julia Gillard. But that's why you can vote by, again, get enough of the numbers to form a majority in yourself. That's usually seen as much better to do the government. It can have its own pitfalls as well, where if you make policy and legislation that's very unpopular with the electorate, then they could be waiting with sharpened pencils for the chance to vote you out at the next election. And that's where hopefully the Senate comes through and helps moderate any legislation. So for legislation to become law, it typically is introduced into the House of Representatives. Bills can be introduced into the Senate, but you can't, for budget bills, they have to go through the House of Representatives. But it then has to, effectively, there's a first round of voting. There's an initial that says, like, what do you want to achieve? All right. Well, you know, and they might say something along those lines. I want to tax people that have pools in their backyards, or something along those lines. And people might just go like, no, that's not a good idea at all. And then they could shut it down, and then attempt to introduce legislation for that is there. But let's say that it is sort of a good idea, then they'll move to debate. It'll get put forward, the draft will be put through, people will review it, they might go through and talk about why they're voting a particular way. Each of the members will get a chance to move amendments, and the House would then vote to see whether these amendments get included into updated legislation. Then I'll use a better example. One that was rather controversial in the last government was an independent commission against corruption, which was a body that could investigate parliamentarians for any wrongdoing, and they could investigate crimes and refer them to the police. I'm not too sure why, but the government that was in the last term, they didn't manage to pass one, even though they promised it. Anyway, so for that election, for an ICAC to get passed, it would then need to be introduced into the House of Representatives. It then has to be voted on or approved initially to say this is what we're generally looking to do. Then the proposed legislation is then put forward for all of the members of the House of Representatives to look at. At some point, usually they'll sit for 2 weeks. Let's just call it every month or something along those lines. It's called a sitting period, even though each house is independent and has its own ability to set its own hours by vote. And they can pass it at any time, and there's messages sent between the two of them, but someone in the House and Senate effectively has no power over someone in the other house. They can't compel them to sit or pass, even though if they're usually from the same political party, they'll typically vote to get some things through. And there have been some cases where they really wanted to get legislation through in a hurry. So they've each house voted to amend and sit at sitting hours to make sure that can happen. So it's discussed. It's then voted upon. Any amendments are made, and that once all of the amendments have been considered, the legislation in its final form is given a final vote. The introduction is called the first reading, the debate is called the second reading, and the third reading is the final tick of approval. So someone who's effectively the sponsor of the bill would, so everyone's spoken about, debated, would say, I move that this bill be read a third time, and then people get to vote yes or no, the ayes and noes. And once that vote's done, sometimes it can be done, if it's done controversial, it can be done by voices. But if it's two people object, so the speaker would say, third reading, the question before the House is the third reading of the ICAC. All those in favour say aye, all those against say no. And you might hear a whole bunch of people say aye, and then when the speaker says all those say no. If two people say no, then they can insist that noes have it, and then it gets put to a formal vote where each person will stand on a particular side of the chamber and have it recorded. Then once it's been read a third time, the legislation then gets put into the inbox of the other place. In this case, the Senate. And the Senate goes through its own process again, a first, second, and third reading, where people get to go through and put motions to any changes. Now, let's say the Senate and the House don't agree, and the Senate wants to make sure that the ICAC has got a specific power or something like that that isn't in the existing legislation. That's okay. They can take this current legislation, put the amendments to it, make a third reading for it, and then it gets put back to the House of Representatives, who then have to accept the bill as is or make changes. And this can go backwards and forwards several different times. And the Constitution, it's only once it gets approved by both of these, that it can go to the Governor General, who can then approve or reject it. And or alternatively, the Governor General can reserve for the Queen's pleasure, because we're still part of the Commonwealth. The Queen, the Governor General, he or she can insist the Queen or the King pass the legislation themselves. But the Governor General is the King's or Queen's representative in our country and can act on their behalf. They get appointed by a short list of recommendation by the Prime Minister of the day, and they're usually very favourable to the government. But they are meant to be an independent third layer. So I can't remember any case where the Governor General has knocked back legislation, and I'm not even sure it's happened. But if there was a legislation that was like to amend the Constitution and go through, that it might get referred back to. But anyway, we'll go back to it. We've got our ICAC, and the Senate has made some changes, so then gets passed back to the House of Representatives. The government's formed in the House of Representatives by whoever has the majority of it. They then get to vote and decide who will be the Prime Minister and then to the ministries, because the people themselves don't vote on who is going to say. We don't get to vote to select who's the Minister of Agriculture or the Minister for Foreign Affairs or the Treasurer. That's all appointed by the people. Once they're elected, sworn in, they go down to Canberra and they all sort that out amongst themselves. The first point of business in the chamber is the election of a speaker as well. So someone has to go through and then act as moderator for it. And the speaker has got some privileges, things along the lines of they can eject people. But these rules have come about because the House of Representatives themselves has allowed rules for people to be ejected. So if people are particularly disorderly, then they can get warned. And in the second time, the person's particularly disorderly, the speaker can then ask the Parliament to vote whether the person should be kicked out for 24 hours or something along those lines. There's another sort of rule as part of the House standing orders that have all been agreed upon, and possibly by previous governments. I'm not sure whether they get thrown out every time a new Parliament sits or they're taken as read. But things like if the people are getting this heated argument and people are particularly unruly, if the speaker stands up, sort of like their teacher in class, then everyone's meant to stop and become return to order. So we've got our ICAC legislation. The Senate's made some changes. It's back in the House of Representatives, and the government has just said this is totally unacceptable to us. We just cannot agree to these changes that you've done. The Constitution allows the Prime Minister to do what's called a double dissolution trigger. And this happens when the House makes some legislation, it puts it to the Senate, and then the Senate has blocked it. And I believe that the Senate has to block it twice on a period of at least 3 months apart. So double dissolution can't happen lightly. And once the government can also bank up several bits of legislation, they might just say, hang on a second, this is vital to the country. It's part of our platform. We said we were going to do it. We're going to stick through it. And we know it's the will of the people. We're not going to be held hostage by, let's just call it, a few of the senators of a small state that would only have a few people in the House. They're just blocking. So the Prime Minister can then go to the Governor General and say, I would like to call a double dissolution election, which then means that the House to get voted on, and the Senate has to get voted on. And I said earlier that some people are out for 6 years. Then in a double dissolution, it doesn't matter. All 76 senators are up for re-election. And in this case, it's actually easier for senators to be re-elected. I missed out with part of the voting earlier, where I said the Senate is based on the area. So everyone in each particular state will get a list of everyone who wants to be senator for that state. And you get to number your ballot from, you might number all of the boxes, and there might be 80 people running. Then once the AEC gets all of the ballots at the end of the night, they count up everyone who's got a first vote, and the person with the fewest first votes gets taken off. But anyone who voted for them as their first preference, they now get their second preference as full value. And effectively, you're voting for your top 6 picks of who was on the Senate sheet. You're voting, and if your first person, the rest of the state doesn't agree with your first person, as you might have very interesting. One of the parties that ran on a platform was no pokies, poker machines. Another one was high-speed rail. So I might have put my high-speed rail party as the first preference, but the rest of the state doesn't see that as much of a priority. So I can still get to choose my pick 6, but of the 80 people there, then we work down my list into maybe the 7th, 8th, and 9th, until eventually there's enough people that have the more popular people have been voted for, if that makes sense. So if we've got 6 slots, this is going to get a bit mathy. If there are 6 slots available, then we figure out how many people have cast a legal vote in the state. We then divide that number by 7, and then that is called a quota. And once someone has got enough votes to earn a quota, then they are going to Canberra. They've been elected, which means that so effectively we do a run through of all of the people to figure out who is sort of the most popular. And then after we've got our first person taken care of, we then shrink the number of available people. I don't think I'm explaining it too well, and in this case, I'd refer people to go to the Senate election. But what it boils down to is you're given a sheet of paper, and you can vote either above the line or below the line. And let's just say you vote below the line, where you get to number each person individually rather than a group or a party. Then you are numbering from the person you most want to see with the number 1, and then work your way up the numbers to say 80 or 90, or how many there. But I think you've only legally got a number 16, but you can number every box if you wish. And there's some rules available if you say make a mistake, where you might put the number 43 down twice. Well, it can still be considered legal, whereas I think at some point that was, even though your numbers 1 to 10 decided who you would be able to vote for, there are cases where your vote might be considered informal and not eligible to be counted if you made a slight mistake like that. But there's savings provisions in there, which means that if you make honest mistakes, then your vote will still be counted as legal. But if you went through and you only put a 1 next to one box because you only wanted to see one politician, or you gave multiple people the number 1, then your vote would be declared informal. Now, let's say you've realized a mistake when you are doing the voting. You can go up to the officials and ask for a new paper. Sorry about that. I sort of lost where I was going, and I finished talking about the Senate voting, the process for voting in the Senate. And I realized I missed voting about how people are voting for the House of Representatives. So there's 2 separate slips when you go into the electorate, the ballot booth, the polling place on the voting day. And I'll go off on a little tangent at the moment and say, hopefully you get a chance to have democracy sausage as well. So if you say you're voting at a school, there might be the local parents and citizens association that put a barbecue on. Once you vote, you go and get a sausage from the barbecue. So you go in to vote, you see the electoral officials, and they'll give you 2 slips of paper. One for the Senate, which we've already discussed, one for the House of Representatives, and there might only be, say, 5 to 12 people on the House of Representatives slip. And again, you're nominating who you want to be the most. We have who you want to nominate in preference of your most preferred to your least preferred. So we've got what's called fully transferable preferential voting, which means that if you know that whoever you want to be as a most candidate isn't really going to win, you still get to put them first. And they can, if they get excluded from the running because a lot more people have votes, then your one vote then moves down the line of your list of preferences until you've got, which possibly is your second least preferred person, because there might only be 2 people left running, and that might be your 11th and 12th preference, in which case your vote will count for the 11th preferred person out of 12. And there's a runoff, so people start, if they do, the AEC does their initial voting, and there's 12 candidates. We find out there's 70,000 people in the electorate, and we figure out that one person only gets 700 votes. Everyone else has got a few thousand. And this person with 700 votes, we take everybody who voted for them first, and we now treat those votes as if their second preference is their first preference, and then we redistribute these votes amongst them. We now might find that the next least popular person out of everyone else has got like 2,500 votes. And it's pretty close, where there's a pretty, someone very leading in the front. They haven't got 50% of the vote yet out of everyone who's cast a legal vote, then they're getting close. And we take those 2,500 people from the person who's the second person to be knocked out, and we redistribute all of their votes. Now, some of these people might have voted for the person who was knocked out first, and then voted for the person that gets knocked out second. Their vote still counts. They then get their third choice, and the people for the 2,500 who voted for the other person, they then get their second choice. And if now we have someone who has more than 50% of all of the legal votes that are cast, and then that's it, we don't do any more distribution and any more knocking about, we now have a winner. But eventually, if we ended up having to knock people out from the list of 12 initially to the point where it's just 2, then we count them all up and then find out who's got more than 50%. If they do, they go. In a rare possibility, it might be split either way. I can imagine in that case, then everyone in the electorate goes back and they get to vote again. And then we go through. So I think I didn't touch on this earlier, so we'll go back to the Independent Commission Against Corruption. So it's come back to the House of Representatives, and the Prime Minister has said if they've put it towards the Senate's knocked it back twice, hasn't considered it acceptable, then they go to the Governor General, they do a double dissolution. Everybody in there, every politician is up for a re-election again. So all 151 House of Representatives, all 76 senators, and because there's now 12 senators slots available for each state, it's actually easier for people to get voted in as a Senate spot, because now they only need 1/13 of the vote instead of 1/7 of the vote. And the Senate has different dynamics. So one of the parties, so you'd normally see Australia's got a few different major parties. There's Labor, Liberal, and one supports business. Labor's more pro-worker, Liberal is more pro-business. And you've also got the Nationals that are the pro-country, and then another one is Greens, where you've got their environment is their main thing they're after. There used to be another party that was called the Democrats, and they were specifically aiming for Senate seats. They had the tagline of "Keep the bastards honest," and they wanted people to vote for them to try and bring a bit of sense in there, and they would sit on the crossbench, and that way whoever formed the largest number in the Senate, it didn't matter who was in the government, any legislation still got to go through the Senate, and they would negotiate with whoever had the majority and try and use their vote to swing especially large amount of power to possibly veto any legislation or make amendments to any legislation coming through and have their voice heard. I think they might have had maybe 6 or 7 at some point, but they're not. I'm not sure there's any Democrats at the moment, but just using them to highlight the way the system works. And so eventually the Prime Minister goes to the Governor General and says, look, we need this, we've got the election. And then, they put the exact same legislation that was put through as passed by the House of Representatives. I think it gets voted on by the House again if it gets passed. And then if it gets rejected by the Senate again, then a special thing called a joint sitting can happen, which is, I've never heard of it happening. It means that exact same legislation, if it is rejected by the Senate, all of the senators, all of the members in the House of Representatives all come into the one chamber, and they put it onto, they have a final vote, which settles the matter. If the people from the House of Representatives, and then this is the only time the people from the House of Representatives and the people from the Senate will be treated as sort of equals or in the same sort of room talking together. If all of this has come through, that the specific legislation, and that way then instead of out of 151 or 76, if you get 50% out of 227 votes, then you could then get that legislation passed. And they could then do this for, let's just say there's 3 different bits of legislation. They could each individually go through the process to figure out and resolve the deadlock. All of the details of this are in the Constitution as to what the steps are going to go through. I think there's some part of it that might have been a bit vague when they were originally writing it, so it may not be put through, because I think one thing that they were unsure about was when they said if we have a double dissolution, so we've now got 12 senators elected, then how do we decide if we go back to the normal half terms and every 3 years we have a Senate election, then who of our state's 12 are going to be up for election in 3 years' time, and who are going to be up for in 12 years' time? Sorry, 6 years' time. So there's some things that still were debated. I think the Senate might have voted on it, or they've reached some sort of amicable arrangement. And so hopefully that's been a bit of an introduction into how voting and parliaments work in Australia. Sorry if I've been a bit rambling. I'm still trying to get used to it. And I do have to say, if you're an Australian citizen and you are able to enrol to vote, the age of voting here is 18. Sorry. If you're an Australian citizen, you're able to enrol to vote. You don't automatically get to vote once you're 18. You need to enrol, and before the rolls close. So if we knew there was going to be an election, they might have a 6-week election campaign. The rolls might close a week after the election's being called. And if I haven't gone to the AEC and registered by that time, then even if I'm otherwise eligible to vote, I can't go and get my voice heard at the time. So you can't just turn up on the day and say, look, I'm over 18, I'm Australian, I need my slip. And the AEC needs to know that you're coming. And so yeah, I'm doing this video series to improve my public speaking, and I hope you found it useful. If you have any feedback, questions, or comments, please leave a message and I'll try and answer as best as I can. And thanks for listening.